torches flickered against the damp stone walls, casting long, trembling shadows that seemed alive. In the heart of Tudor England, whispers carried through darkened corridors. They spoke not of victory nor of glory, but of a woman whose very name struck terror into the marrow of her people. Bloody Mary. Imagine standing before a queen whose eyes blazed like fire, yet brimmed with grief that had hardened into iron. To her, the throne was not just a seat of power, it was a battlefield, one she had fought for her entire life. Born Mary Tudor, the daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, her story began not in triumph, but in abandonment. When Henry cast aside Catherine in his desperate pursuit of a male heir, Mary's world crumbled. Once a beloved princess, she became a bastard in the eyes of the crown, stripped of her titles, her dignity, and nearly her hope. The child who once walked palace halls in silks now lived in near exile, shamed and humiliated, watching as her father paraded new queens before the world. And yet Mary endured. Each humiliation planted a seed, each betrayal watered it, until her spirit hardened like tempered steel. Her faith, fierce and unshakable, became her lifeline. She clung to her Catholic upbringing with a devotion so absolute that it would one day define her reign. But before she could seize the throne, Mary had to survive her father's merciless reforms and her half-brother, Edward's Protestant regime. She was spied upon, threatened, and pressured to forsake her beliefs. Still, she refused to yield. Those who saw her in those years whispered of a woman who bore herself like a martyr, ready to die rather than bend. When Edward VI's health failed, conspiracies swirled like a brewing storm. Mary's cousin, Lady Jane Grey, was proclaimed queen in a desperate Protestant gambit. But Mary, fearless and resolute, rode forth with banners raised. Against all odds, the people rallied to her side. Farmers, townsfolk, even noblemen flocked to her cause. In a stunning reversal, Jane's reign lasted mere 9 days before Mary entered London as its rightful queen. The cheers of the crowd that day must have echoed like salvation in her ears. After years of humiliation, she had triumphed. Yet the very forces that had carried her to power would soon demand blood in return. For Mary was not content to rule as a figurehead. She intended to save England's soul, no matter the cost. The question was not whether she would succeed. It was how far she would go. The bells of London rang out in triumph as Mary Tudor was crowned Queen of England in October 1553. Dressed in crimson and gold, she seemed every inch a monarch, chosen by heaven itself. For a brief, dazzling moment, the city embraced her. Citizens crowded the streets, waving flags and shouting blessings. After years of turmoil, they longed for stability, for order, and Mary promised both. Yet beneath the pomp and celebration, a storm brewed. England had changed since the days of her childhood. The Protestant faith, once a flicker of rebellion, now burned brightly across the realm. Mary, steadfast in her Catholic devotion, saw it not as progress but as heresy, a poison eating away at the very soul of the nation. God has placed me here, she declared to her council, her voice steady but fierce. It is my duty to restore his true church, even if it costs me all. The cost would soon become clear. Her first bold move was to restore ties with Rome, re-establishing allegiance to the Pope. Many of her subjects, weary of endless shifts in doctrine under Henry and Edward, sighed with relief. Others clenched their fists in silent resistance. Mary's next step was marriage, an alliance that would bind her to the most powerful Catholic dynasty in Europe. She chose Philip of Spain, a prince whose stern demeanor and foreign manner unsettled her people. When news of the match spread, London erupted in protest. "We will not be ruled by Spain," shouted merchants and apprentices, fearing their freedoms would vanish under a foreign king. Still, Mary pressed forward. In her eyes, the marriage was not about love or politics. It was about salvation. Together, she and Philip would safeguard the Catholic faith and secure a Catholic heir. For Mary, every sacrifice, every risk, was justified by the promise of England's eternal soul. But the shadows of opposition grew darker. Rebellions stirred in the countryside, led by men who vowed to keep Protestantism alive. And Mary, hardened by a lifetime of betrayal, responded not with mercy, but with fire. The first executions began quietly, a preacher here, a dissenter there. But soon, flames rose in market squares across the kingdom. Crowds gathered, some jeering, others weeping as the condemned cried out prayers while the fire consumed them. The Queen's resolve did not waver. To her, these were not victims, they were warnings. Each rising plume of smoke declared her message to the realm. The old faith had returned, and it would be enforced not by persuasion, but by fear. The people who once cheered her coronation now whispered a new name. Bloody Mary. The title, Bloody Mary, spread like wildfire, whispered in taverns and marketplaces, etched into the hearts of those who feared the crown's iron grip. Yet behind the stern visage of the Queen, a different story unfolded, one of longing, heartbreak, and a woman caught between her duty and her humanity. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain, sealed in Winchester Cathedral, was meant to be her triumph. Draped in jewels, she looked radiant beside him, her face alight with hope. Here at last was a partner to share her mission, a husband who would help secure a Catholic dynasty. But Philip was not the prince of her dreams. Cold, distant, and bound by duty to Spain, he treated England less as a home and more as a stepping stone. Still, Mary clung to him. Her courtiers whispered that the Queen's affection was unreturned. But she refused to believe it. When her belly began to swell, she proclaimed with joy that she carried the long-awaited heir. Bells rang once more, and prayers filled cathedrals. For a brief moment, it seemed God had blessed her cause. But months later, the truth revealed itself in cruel fashion. There was no child, only a phantom pregnancy. The court fell silent, joy collapsing into unease, and though Mary tried to hide her despair, her face betrayed her. This humiliation cut deeper than any rebellion, striking at her very womanhood, her very purpose as queen. Philip returned to Spain soon after, leaving Mary isolated, surrounded by murmurs of doubt. Desperate to secure her legacy, she threw herself deeper into her mission of religious restoration. More heretics were tried, more pyres lit. Bishops, scholars, even common laborers, none were safe if they defied the Queen's faith. And yet Mary was no monster in her own mind. She believed with every fiber of her being that each execution was an act of mercy, a soul snatched from the flames of eternal damnation. To those who watched, though, the fires consumed not just flesh, but hope. The more Mary pressed, the more resistance smoldered. Protestant writings, spread in secret, smuggled across borders, fueling defiance. Every execution added fuel to the legend of Bloody Mary, a name that painted her not as a savior, but as a tyrant. In her private chambers, however, she prayed for forgiveness, clutching rosary beads until her fingers ached. She begged God for guidance, for love, for an heir, but the heavens remained silent.
And the Queen's burden grew heavier with each passing day.
The fires that once roared with Mary's conviction began to flicker against the tide of reality. Her subjects grew restless, their fear sharpening into resentment. While some still bowed to her with trembling reverence, many now prayed in secret for her death. The Queen who had fought so hard to claim her throne was losing the very hearts she had sworn to guide. In 1557, Philip returned briefly to England, but not for Mary. He came to demand support for Spain's wars against France. Ever devoted, she agreed, committing English troops and treasure to a cause her people did not share. The campaign ended in disaster. Calais, England's last foothold on the continent, fell into French hands. It was a humiliation so profound that even hardened soldiers wept. For Mary, it was a wound to her soul. "When I am dead and opened," she reportedly said, "they shall find Calais lying in my heart." Her subjects now whispered that she was not only cruel, but cursed. No child had blessed her womb. No victories crowned her reign. Instead, fire and failure trailed her steps. The queen who once strode proudly into London now moved as a shadow of herself. Weighed down by grief, Mary's health faltered. A second phantom pregnancy swelled her belly, igniting hope once more, only to collapse again into despair. Each disappointment drained her spirit further, as though heaven itself mocked her devotion. Her once bright eyes grew sunken, her figure frail, her strength fading. Even in her weakness, the executions continued. Bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, then Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, men of influence, were burned before vast crowds. Their deaths sent shockwaves through Europe, hardening Protestant resolve. Instead of uniting her kingdom, Mary's campaign only deepened its divisions. Philip, ever distant, sent only letters. His ambitions lay far from England's troubled shores. The people saw their queen as abandoned, clinging to a love that had withered into formality. By 1558, Mary was broken in body and spirit. Fever consumed her, leaving her bedridden in St. James's Palace. Courtiers whispered outside her chamber, already shifting their allegiance to her half-sister, Elizabeth, whose Protestant faith promised a new direction for the realm. On November 17th, the bells of London tolled, not in celebration, but in mourning. Mary Tudor, the first crowned Queen of England, was dead at 42. Her reign, scarred by fire and loss, ended in silence. But her story was far from over. In the years to come, her name would twist into legend, a cautionary tale of power, faith, and fear. When Mary Tudor's body was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey, few could have guessed how her shadow would linger across centuries. Her crown passed to Elizabeth, the sister she had once sought to control, and with it, England's future shifted forever. Elizabeth would be hailed as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Her reign celebrated as a golden age. Mary, in stark contrast, was remembered not for her courage or her victories, but for the fires she lit. History, as it so often does, chose its heroes and villains. Mary became Bloody Mary, a monarch reduced to a single, damning image, the queen who burned her own people. In truth, her reign was more complex. She had been the first woman to claim England's throne in her own right, breaking centuries of precedent. She had faced conspiracies, rebellions, and betrayals with a courage few could deny, and yet her unyielding devotion to faith and her desperate need for an heir clouded her legacy in smoke and sorrow. Generations later, the name Bloody Mary took on a life of its own. In English lore, it became more than a queen. It became a ghost. Children whispered of summoning her spirit in mirrors, daring one another to speak her name in the dark. The historical queen, flesh and blood, grief and ambition, was eclipsed by a legend of terror. But perhaps there is something fitting in this transformation. Mary Tudor herself lived as both a woman and a symbol. To her supporters, she was the hand of God, chosen to restore the old faith. To her enemies, she was a tyrant draped in crimson, a figure of fear. In the centuries that followed, those two visions merged into a myth that still chills the imagination today. And yet, if one listens closely to the silence of history, a different Mary emerges, a young girl cast aside by her father, a princess who fought for dignity when the world called her illegitimate, a queen who longed for love, who prayed for an heir, who ruled with a conviction that, though harsh, was undeniably hers. Her story is not one of simple cruelty, but of tragedy. She was a woman shaped by betrayal, bound by duty, and consumed by a vision of salvation that demanded sacrifice. In the end, she gave everything, her crown, her body, her very legacy, to a cause that history would not forgive. So when we whisper her name today, whether in history books or in ghost stories, we are not just invoking a legend of blood. We are remembering a queen who terrified England, and who was, perhaps just as terrified herself, enjoying this chilling look into England's darkest queen. Make sure to hit that subscribe button for more dark history deep dives if you found this story gripping. Give it a like and let me know in the comments. Do you think Mary deserved the title Bloody Mary, or was history unfair to her?